An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. All right, so today we'll be discussing the chapter on calmness, which I picked out because when I first read this book over 15 years ago, I had absolutely no comprehension of anything in this chapter, and I was hoping that my understanding had evolved since then, and it turns out it has. So I do feel like that we can benefit from studying this chapter. So I'm going to go through it paragraph by paragraph and then discuss it. And you can follow along if you have the book. It starts on page 112.
152 in the small book.
Okay, 152 in the small book. There are different editions, yes. So it starts off with a quote, and it says, "For Zen students, a weed is a treasure." A Zen poem says, "After the wind stops, I see a flower falling. Because of the singing bird, I find the mountain calmness. Before something happens in the realm of calmness, we do not feel the calmness. Only when something happens within it do we find the calmness. There is a Japanese saying, 'For the moon, there is the cloud. For the flower, there is the wind.' When we see a part of the moon covered by a cloud, or a tree, or a weed, we feel how round the moon is. But when we see the clear moon without anything covering it, we do not feel that roundness the same way we do when we see it through something else." So what this is discussing here is the necessity of experiencing suffering to comprehend true joy and beauty of our Buddha nature. And how we find that out is through our suffering. If everything was just happy times all the time, we would never discover the nature of our Buddha nature because, we wouldn't see the fact that life is suffering. And I had a story that kind of relates to that. Nowadays, I refer to myself as a writer and an artist. But looking back at my life, if I look back at myself, say at age 12, I did not refer to myself as either of those things, even though I wrote just as much as I do now, and I did even more art than I do now. But, the artist was always within me. It was just being sublimated because people were encouraging me to study science instead, or to do something that would make more money. So I didn't think of anything of developing my artist nature, but yet I still drew through all these years of studying science, and still did art and still wrote the whole time. But I never thought of myself as an artist or a writer until just this past year or so when I started working on a book. And also I might be getting a job teaching art soon, which makes me really happy that I can share my love of art with others. But until I discovered, until I started calling myself that, I didn't consider myself to be an artist or a writer, even though I was those things that entire time. And in the same way, we don't discover our Buddha nature until we recognize it in ourselves. The path of suffering leads to that recognition. The reason we don't recognize our Buddha nature, the reason I didn't recognize it, was part of my karma for unskillful actions. The shame and the guilt made me not recognize my Buddha nature. But once I did recognize it, if I hadn't suffered, I would not have recognized it for what it was. And now I can see that I do have this Buddha nature inside, and that it's always been there. On to the next paragraph. When you are doing Zazen, you are within the complete calmness of your mind. You do not feel anything. You just sit. But the calmness of your sitting will encourage you in your everyday life. So actually, you will find the value of Zen in your everyday life rather than while you sit. But this does not mean that you should neglect Zazen. Even though you do not feel anything when you sit, if you do not have this Zazen experience, you cannot find anything. You just find weeds or trees or clouds in your daily life. You do not see the moon. This is why you are always complaining about something. But for Zen students, a weed, which for most people is worthless, is a treasure. With this attitude, whatever you do, life becomes an art. And there's a lot to take out of this paragraph right here. First of all, when it talks about, but the calmness of your sitting will encourage you in your everyday life. So actually you will find the value of Zen in your everyday life rather than while you sit. And there it's encouraging you to stay on the Eightfold Path and to speak an act of compassion and wisdom. And that path is brought to you by the calmness of your sitting. It just encourages you to bring it out into your everyday life. And when it says, if you do not have the Zazen experience, you cannot find anything. You just find weeds or trees or clouds in your daily life. You do not see the moon. This is why you're always complaining about something. In that case, you're stuck in a cycle of samsara and suffering, just like everybody else. And the way to get out of that cycle is by practicing Zazen. But for Zen students, a weed, which for most people is worthless, is a treasure. With this attitude, whatever you do, life becomes an art. Our difficulties help us see our true nature, our Buddha self, in contrast to our suffering. We would not be who we are without distressing emotions and their aftermath. Also, they provide impetus to stay on the Zen path. Recently, I was very sad and depressed, and I was also reading a book called 8-Step Recovery, which is designed for people that want to go about recovery from substances from a Buddhist standpoint. It's a really good book for anybody that might be interested. And one of the meditations in the book was to do a meditation on how your life has changed in the past 10 years, the past 5 years, the past year, and then the past day. So I did the meditation, and I was just amazed at how much I've become a far better person, even in the past year, in my thinking and behavior. And I just couldn't perceive it, how I'd improved. And, never mind the past 5 or 10 years, which I'd improved even more. But I couldn't see it in my depression. I was just stuck in it. And I realized that all my current weeds, as you would call them here, that were distressing me, they were a catalyst towards my making an even better future for myself. And I just couldn't see it at the time. But once I reflected on it, I could see how I'd improved with my suffering. If I hadn't suffered, I wouldn't have improved as much as I had. When you practice Zazen, you should not try to attain anything. You should just sit in the complete calmness of your mind and not rely on anything. Just keep your body straight without leaning over or against something. To keep your body straight means not to rely on anything. In this way, physically and mentally, you will obtain complete calmness. But to rely on something or to try to do something in Zazen is dualistic and not complete calmness. And that's when we start getting into the meat of this chapter. First of all, when it says keep your body straight without leaning over or against something and not to rely on anything, one thing I've noticed is that when I meditate, if I get stuck in a thought and keep following that thought, I just start slumping over, or I start falling over. It's really reflective if you can stay straight on how your thinking is going, or at least for me it's that case. And when it says not to rely on anything, when it says that you keep complete calmness of your mind, he's not saying that your mind is going to be completely blank. And that's how I interpreted it that way the first time I read this passage. It's like, oh, my mind will be blank. And of course that never happens. There's always going to be something going on in the mind, but the whole point is to not get attached to it. You let the thoughts and emotions flow without getting attached. And that's how you not rely on anything. You don't rely on any thoughts or any emotions to carry you through the meditation. You rely on no thought, which is going past those thoughts and letting them flow past you. Next paragraph. In our everyday life, we are usually trying to do something, trying to change something into something else, or trying to attain something. Just this trying is already in itself an expression of our true nature. The meaning lies in the effort itself. We should find out the meaning of our effort before we attain something. So Dogen said, we should attain enlightenment before we attain enlightenment. It is not after attaining enlightenment that we find its true meaning. The trying to do something in itself is enlightenment. When we are in difficulty or distress, there we have enlightenment. When we are in defilement, there we should have composure. Usually we find it very difficult to live in the evanescence of life, but it is only within the evanescence of life that we can find the joy of eternal life. And there's a whole lot going on in that paragraph that I did not understand at all the first time I read it. And I just kind of skipped over it and said, I'm never going to understand this. But it actually is helping me understand other questions that I had when I first started practicing Zen with this group, which I'll get to in a minute. But first of all, talking about in our everyday life, we are usually trying to do something, trying to change something into something else, or trying to attain something. We're subject to attachment and aversion, and that's what he's getting at there. Just this trying is already in itself an expression of our true nature, because we're stuck in the suffering of samsara because of our attachments and aversions. The meaning lies in the effort itself. We should find out the meaning of our effort before we attain something. What we do is we try to figure out, are we trying to avoid or attach to some experience? And that includes an enlightenment experience. So Dogen said, we should attain enlightenment before we attain enlightenment. And that's just a quote that is amazing to me now that I think about it. And I can relate it back to the Heart Sutra too, especially when I add in the part about the trying to do something is in itself enlightenment. Because there was something about the Heart Sutra that really confused me when I thought about it at first. And it was the part where it says, there is nothing to attain, and then it says we have attained unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. How is there nothing to attain, yet you attain something? I didn't understand that. And I even asked Dean, and he basically threw the question back at me and said, well, what do you think? So I gave it some thought. And I think it does relate to that quote of Dogen's, we should attain enlightenment before we attain enlightenment. There is nothing to attain refers to the fact that trying to do something in a zazen is dualistic and not complete calmness, as he puts it in the previous paragraph. Because if you're trying to obtain enlightenment, then you don't have a good motivation. It's just part of the grasping, the attachment. But if you have attained complete, perfect enlightenment, you know that the process of trying to gain enlightenment is all you need. You don't need to actually gain anything. You just need to try. And then we get to the part where it says, but it is only within the evanescence of life that we can find the joy of eternal life. True enlightenment comes off the cushion. When he talks about how we have to have composure in difficult situations, it means that, you know, excuse me, it means that, excuse me. When it says that it's difficult to live in the evanescence of life, it's referring to that cycle of suffering. It's referring to the fact that normally we have that attachment and that aversion to life. We don't want to be in the form of enlightenment. We don't want to have an enlightenment experience. We just want to attach to something, or we want to get something away from us. But if we have true enlightenment, then we don't feel those feelings, or we do feel those feelings, but we can ignore it and go about it with good motivations and go about life with wisdom and compassion, because compassion is true enlightenment. Going on to the next paragraph, by continuing your practice with this sort of understanding, you can improve yourself. But if you try to attain something without this understanding, you cannot work on it properly. You lose yourself in the struggle for your goal, you achieve nothing, you just continue to suffer in your difficulties. But with right understanding, you can make some progress. Then, whatever you do, even though not perfect, will be based on your inmost nature, and little by little something will be achieved. And I really like this paragraph, and I related the last part of it to a Japanese proverb, which is, seeing pure awareness without engaging lovingly with our life is a daydream. Living in this relative world without vision is a nightmare. And the first part of that, the part about life is a daydream, I kind of see as like, just getting high off an enlightened experience, getting high off of drugs, something like that. You might see something there, but you're not going to live in wisdom. But also, living without vision is a nightmare. The vision and wise action is key, not the attainment of a goal. You don't need to attain a goal to not live in the nightmare. You just need the vision and the wise action. And where it says, little by little, something will be achieved. There's no perfect progress or attainment. But by walking the path with right understanding, progress is made little by little towards life wisdom, which pertains to compassion, because as Dean has mentioned in the past, compassion is wisdom. So we act out with compassion instead of just acting by our aversion or desires. Next paragraph. Which is more important, to attain enlightenment or to attain enlightenment before you attain enlightenment? To make $1 million or to enjoy your life and your effort, little by little, even though it is impossible to make that million? To be successful or to find some meaning in your effort to be successful? If you do not know the answer, you will not even be able to practice zazen. If you do know, you will have found the true treasure of life. Success without compassion or wisdom leads to misery for oneself or others. I've seen it happen in real life. I've seen people that were so successful by society standards, yet their lives were entirely miserable, and I would never want to be them. It kind of put me off of success, honestly. I used to grow up, people would tell me, oh, be successful. That's all you need to do. Make money and you'll be fine. But I learned that that wasn't the answer. I learned from watching others around me. But if you do know, you will have found the true treasure of life. And the true treasure of life is making decisions based on one's Buddha nature, the Buddha nature that you recognize by sitting zazen. It's uncovered during both sitting and in life like a diamond. I kind of think of the Buddha self as like a diamond that's within each of us. And sometimes diamonds are covered with dirt, and you have to take away all the dirt. And then you have to facet the diamond. And the zazen, practicing zazen, is kind of like faceting the diamond to make it shine for all the world. And with that, that concludes my talk.